Only I came to my husband's funeral, not our son, not our daughter, not even a grandchild to place a single white rose. Just me standing by the coffin of Edward Ellison, while the Cornish wind howled through the cliffside chapel like a living thing tired of human sorrow. The Atlantic roared below the stone terrace. Gulls circled overhead, their cries slicing the air like fractured hymns. Inside, the pews were almost empty, a scattering of flowers, a half-hearted pastor, and the faint smell of salt and polish. Edward had always hated fuss. "When I go, keep it simple," he used to say, "and for God's sake, don't let them play that dreadful organ." He'd have chuckled to see this. A service so quiet even the sea refused to pause. The funeral director shifted awkwardly by the door, his voice trembling in the chill. "Would you like us to wait a few more minutes, Mrs. Ellison? Perhaps your family?" I shook my head. No. Edward despised delays. He nodded, relieved to have a decision, and gestured for the pastor to begin. The prayers blurred. The flowers were too bright, the air too sharp. I sat alone on the front pew, gloved hands folded tightly in my lap. Edward's coffin gleamed under the weak winter-light mahogany polished to perfection, even though he'd have preferred the plain pine kind. Everything around me felt artificial except the wind. I thought of how he'd lived, precise, punctual, a man of tides and clocks, a thalassophile to the end, measuring his world by currents and constellations. He'd folded his sweaters with military precision and always left his compass by the bedside, as though even dreams required navigation. The service ended too quickly. The pallbearers carried him toward the graveyard that overlooked the sea, a small plot fenced with driftwood and lichen. I followed behind, the only footsteps on the gravel path. When they lowered the casket, I heard the thud of earth like a heartbeat stopping. The plaque at the foot of the grave read simply, "Edward Ellison, 1939, 2024, husband, father, navigator." But the word that echoed in my head was the one no stone dared carve forgotten. When I returned home, the cottage by the sea was too quiet. His slippers still waited beside the armchair, his pipe on the mantel, the brass telescope pointing out toward the horizon he used to chart. I could still smell the faint sweetness of pipe, tobacco, and wool. The house, though small, suddenly felt enormous, every silence a canyon. I poured myself a glass of red wine from a bottle we'd once saved for guests who never came. I hadn't planned to drink, but grief has its own logic, and I followed it. My hands, still gloved, trembled slightly as I scrolled through my phone. I don't often check social media, the noise always felt foreign to me, but tonight something urged me to look. Nathan's post appeared first, a smiling selfie in London, champagne glass raised high, celebrating the new merger, perfect week. Then Clara's, a photo of her at brunch in Brighton, hair immaculate, mimosas sparkling in the sunlight. Sunday girls' date, living beautifully. They hadn't called, not even a message saying I'm sorry. I stared at the glowing screen until my reflection blurred in the glass. Then I turned it off and placed it face down beside Edward's compass. The house ticked with 1,000 small noises, wood contracting, the clock above the fireplace sighing every minute. I stood in front of the mantel, studying a photograph of us from decades ago. Our 50th anniversary, both smiling awkwardly at the camera, his arm wrapped around my shoulder, the sea a sheet of silver behind us. I whispered, "You'd have laughed at this, wouldn't you? A ceremony for ghosts." Outside, the tide had turned. The sound of waves against the rocks below was steady, almost soothing, a metronome for grief. Tomorrow, I thought, I would call Mr. Alistair Crane. Edward's will was clear enough, written 2 years ago, sealed with our usual careful signatures, but I would change it, quietly, without guilt. If I was the only one who stood beside him in death, then I would be the only one to carry his name with dignity. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and the lighthouse beam swept across the walls every 15 seconds like a ghost hand keeping time. I rose, unable to rest, and wandered into the study Edward had loved. There, under the worn brass lamp, sat a small tin box marked estate. Inside lay our will, a few letters, the property deeds, and the names of those we once trusted to remember us. Nathan, Clara. I touched the ink of their names, black, bold, confident, and felt something inside me turn brittle. Grief doesn't only break you. Sometimes it reveals the rot that was already there. I sat down and wrote a note on the back of Edward's old navigation chart. Mr. Crane, call me at your earliest convenience. I intend to make revisions to my will. All prior beneficiaries are to be reviewed. I folded the paper neatly, sealed it, and placed it beside the compass. Then I whispered toward the sea, "We'll chart a new course, my love. For once, it'll be mine." If this story has already stirred something quiet in you, something that remembers what it feels like to be the last one standing, take a moment. If it moved you, leave a comment or a like. Not for me. For every woman who ever learned that peace sometimes looks like solitude. Morning came gray and hollow, the kind of Cornish dawn where the mist doesn't rise, it lingers, like grief that refuses to evaporate. I made tea, not out of thirst, but ritual. Edward's mug sat beside mine on the counter, still faintly stained at the rim from his last Earl Grey. I couldn't bring myself to wash it. There was comfort in its quiet defiance, like he might walk in any minute, shrug off his coat, and ask why I looked so serious over breakfast. The gulls outside cried like restless spirits. Somewhere, the church bell tolled 9 times too loud, too soon. When the phone rang, the sound startled me. It had been silent for days. "Mrs. Ellison," came the familiar voice of Mr. Alistair Crane, calm and measured as a metronome. "I received your note. You wish to make alterations to your will?" "Yes," I said, gripping the receiver tighter than necessary. "Today, if possible." He hesitated only a moment. "You're certain?" "As certain as the tide," I replied. There was a pause the kind lawyers give when they want to measure your sanity. Then he said, "I'll clear my afternoon." The rest of the morning dragged like wet fabric. I wandered from room to room, half ghost, half housekeeper. Edward's study still smelled faintly of brine and ink. His telescope faced east, toward the horizon he'd never stopped chasing. I touched the eyepiece, cool and dusty. "You always looked for land ahead," I whispered. "I suppose now it's my turn to look back." The cupboard in the hallway groaned when I opened it. Inside were boxes marked Nathan, school, Clara, wedding, and one unlabeled, stuffed with things too painful to categorize. I dragged them into the sitting room and began sorting through their contents as though cataloging their absence might somehow explain it. Inside Nathan's box, university letters, faded pay slips, a receipt for a car I'd paid half for. Beneath it, a note in Edward's handwriting. "He's too much like me, wants control of everything except himself." Inside Clara's, photographs of her wedding in the Brighton Pavilion, a letter she'd written me once in her 20s. "Mum, thank you for everything. I promise I'll make you proud." She never wrote again. The unlabeled box held something smaller, a cracked pocket watch that had once been Edward's father's. It had stopped at 2:47. I couldn't remember if that was morning or afternoon. By noon, I'd decided to walk to the solicitor's office myself. The air outside was sharp enough to sting. The cliffs loomed on my left, the sea roared beneath, and I thought of how Edward used to say the Atlantic taught him everything he knew about loyalty. "It always comes back," he'd say, "no matter how far it drifts." I envied that certainty. My children had drifted and never once turned around. Mr. Crane's office sat at the edge of town, a narrow stone building with brass lettering and the smell of old paper and eucalyptus oil. Inside, the heat hummed too loud, and the clock on the wall ticked with deliberate patience. He stood as I entered, tall and silver-haired, his spectacles glinting. "Mrs. Ellison," he said softly, "my condolences. Edward was a good man." "He was," I said, sitting. "The best kind of ordinary." He nodded, the way professionals do when emotion has no legal standing. "You mentioned revisions?" "Yes." I placed the envelope on his desk. "Remove Nathan and Clara from all clauses. Every account, the cottage, the boat shed, the savings, everything." He didn't blink. He'd known me too long to mistake grief for madness. "May I ask why?" "Because I buried my husband alone," I said, "and they buried their consciences along with him." He studied me for a long moment. "Shall I assume you wish to redirect the estate?" "Yes," I said, "to my grandson, Oliver Hayes." A faint smile ghosted his lips. "Ah, the young man who helped at the service." "The only one who came," I corrected. We spent 2 hours drafting the amendments. His pen scratched steadily against parchment, each stroke sounding like a verdict. "The trust," he explained, "can be structured to protect him until he's 30. Withdrawals only for education, medical needs, or a first home. You'd like it irrevocable? Irrevocable, I repeated firmly. I don't want it undone. Not by guilt, nor by lawyers. When he finished, he looked up, his voice gentler now. You're very calm, Mrs. Ellison. Clarity often feels like calm, I said, even when it's born from heartbreak. He inclined his head. I'll file it by tomorrow. Shall I send copies to Nathan and Clara? No, I said. Let silence deliver the message. It will reach them faster than paper ever could. When I stepped outside, the mist had begun to lift. For the first time in weeks, the sun broke through the clouds, not warm, just visible. I stood there a while, letting it touch my face. A woman passed with her child, laughing, her scarf caught by the wind. I didn't envy her. I just noted the sound bright, uncomplicated, alive. The sea was visible at the end of the street, its surface glinting like glass. Edward had always said light on water was the closest thing to grace a mortal could witness. I think I finally understood what he meant. Grace isn't forgiveness, it's the quiet that comes after you stop begging for it. That evening, I brewed fresh tea and placed it beside Edward's compass on the mantel. The air felt lighter, the rooms wider. There's a peace that arrives when you stop expecting applause for your endurance. I had spent 78 years mistaking patience for love. Today, I'd simply called it by its right name, neglect. And as I watched the last streaks of sunset fade into the horizon, I whispered, the tide has turned. The storm came before the knock. A true Cornish tempest, the kind Edward used to call a winter tantrum, when the sea raged against the cliffs like a beast that couldn't find its way home. I stood by the window, tea in hand, watching the rain claw at the glass. I'd just begun to feel the strange comfort of silence when I heard it. 3 sharp raps at the door, quick, impatient, like guilt, dressed as urgency. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Mother, said Clara Ellison, haze as she swept in, shaking off her umbrella as though she were casting out an inconvenience rather than rain. Her perfume reached me before her eyes did citrus and something metallic underneath. She looked exactly as she always had, immaculate, curated, exhausted from the effort of appearing effortless. Clara, I said, you look well. She gave a short, brittle laugh. You don't. Grief isn't flattering, I replied, closing the door. Tea? I won't stay long, she said, dropping her designer bag on the table as if to mark territory. I came because Oliver told me something that can't possibly be true. I kept my tone even. If it's about the will, it's true. Her expression hardened, and for the first time since she was a child, I saw my own defiance staring back at me. You're cutting Nathan and me out? Entirely? Yes. She blinked, as if the word had a texture she couldn't swallow. You can't be serious. I'm old, Clara, I said, returning to my chair by the window. Seriousness is the only thing I have left. The silence between us stretched until the rain filled it. She paced, heels clicking against the floorboards Edward had laid himself 50 years ago. After everything we've done for you, she began. Everything you've done? I asked. List it. I'm curious. She faltered. We visited. Once. We called. On holidays. She bristled. You make it sound as if we abandoned you. I set my cup down gently. You did. The simplicity of it seemed to wound her more than shouting ever could. You don't understand, she said, her voice tightening. Nathan and I have lives, careers, responsibilities. We can't just show up for your father's funeral? I interrupted. Her cheeks flushed. That's not fair. No, I said. It's accurate. She turned away, arms crossed, her reflection flickering in the rain-streaked window. You're angry. You're grieving. I get that. But to cut us out entirely, it's vindictive. It's clarity, I said quietly. For once, I'm not confusing love with obligation. Clara's lips trembled before her face hardened again. You've always had a flair for drama. I learned it from you, I said, and for a second, a flash of guilt crossed her eyes, brief as lightning over the sea. She walked to the mantel, fingers grazing Edward's compass. He would have hated this, she said. No, I replied. He'd have hated what came before it, the forgetting. Her jaw tightened. I didn't forget. I just couldn't come. Couldn't? I said. Or wouldn't? Her silence answered for her. I stood, crossing the room slowly, the way one approaches an injured animal. Your father spent his life crossing oceans to come home to you, Clara, and you couldn't cross a few hours of motorway to stand beside him when he left this world." She flinched as if struck. "Stop," she said, voice shaking. "I did stop," I whispered. "For years, I stopped asking why, stopped hoping, stopped demanding more than crumbs. But I'm done stopping now." Tears welled in her eyes, but pride kept them from falling. "So this is how it ends? You cut us off and think that makes you free?" "It doesn't make me free," I said. "It makes me honest." She looked at me, then really looked, and, for a heartbeat, I thought she might apologize. But instead, she scoffed softly. "You'll regret this. You'll die alone in this cold house, and we won't be there." I smiled faintly. "That's already happened, darling." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She grabbed her bag, straightened her coat, and walked toward the door. When she reached it, she hesitated, hand on the knob. "I hope this makes you feel powerful," she said. "No," I replied. "It makes me feel peaceful." She left without another word. The storm had softened by the time I returned to the window. The clouds had thinned, and through the mist I could see the faint outline of the sea. The lighthouse blinked in the distance, steadfast, indifferent. On the floor beside the door lay an envelope. No stamp, no name, just paper, folded with too much force. "You don't understand how hard it is to balance everything. Maybe we failed, but this isn't the answer." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer labeled Miscellaneous. It joined receipts, old postcards, and other remnants of things once meant to mean something. That night, I dreamt of Edward. Not as he'd been in the hospital, but years before on the deck of his ship, smiling against the wind. In the dream, he looked at me and said, "The compass only points north if you remember where you're standing." I woke with tears on my cheeks and a strange calm in my chest. For the first time in a long while, I knew exactly where I stood. The call came the next morning. Not from Clara, of course. From Nathan. His voice carried that careful, rehearsed tone, the kind people use when they're about to manipulate politeness into permission. "Mother," he began, "I was wondering if we could talk." "I imagine you were," I said, glancing toward the sea. "Come by then. Bring whatever it is you plan to say." There was a pause. "Cynthia will join me." "Of course she will," I said, and hung up before courtesy could grow teeth. By afternoon, the clouds had thinned into ribbons of pale light. I set the kettle on, though I knew neither of them would want tea. People who feed on control rarely hunger for warmth. Their car pulled up with the self-importance of something leased on credit. Nathan emerged first. Tailored coat, polished shoes, the faint gleam of a watch he couldn't really afford. Cynthia followed, her heels striking the gravel like punctuation marks. "Mother," he said, leaning forward as if for a kiss I didn't offer, "you look well." I smiled faintly. "Grief is an excellent diet." He hesitated, unsure if I was joking. "May we come in?" "You already have," I said, stepping aside. They stood in the sitting room like guests, touring an estate they hoped to inherit. Cynthia's gaze flicked over the paintings, the furniture, the small brass telescope by the window. Her smile was polite, precise, the kind worn by women who rehearse empathy in mirrors. Nathan broke the silence. "We heard about the changes. News travels fast when there's money attached," I said. He exhaled through his nose. "Mother, you have to understand. This isn't rational. You're acting out of grief." "Perhaps," I said, "but grief is honest. You should try it sometime." His jaw tightened. "You're cutting us out completely? After everything?" I gestured to the armchairs opposite me. "Sit down. Let's discuss this like adults." They did, perching stiffly, as though afraid the upholstery might stain them. Cynthia spoke first. "We understand you've left everything to Oliver." "Yes." "Why?" "Because he came," I said simply. "That's absurd," she said, voice sharp. "He's a boy, not a banker. He can't manage property, taxes, maintenance." "He can manage kindness," I interrupted. "That's rarer than any of those." Nathan ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "Mother, this isn't about sentiment. This is about practicality." "No," I said. "This is about consequence." Cynthia exchanged a glance with him, then leaned forward, her tone softening like silk over wire. "You've always been generous. That's one of your best traits. But generosity shouldn't turn into punishment." I smiled. "You've mistaken boundaries for punishment." He tried again, his voice now dipped in persuasion. I know we weren't as present as we should have been. As present? I echoed. Nathan, you didn't attend your father's funeral. You didn't even call. You sent a text. He looked down. I didn't know what to say. Goodbye would have been a start, I said. His silence trembled between us, fragile as blown glass. Cynthia reached for her husband's hand, the gesture rehearsed. We all process loss differently, she offered. Yes, I said. Some with flowers, others with invoices. She flinched but recovered quickly. We're only concerned that this decision may be seen as impulsive. The law can be unforgiving. Then it and I have that in common, I replied. Nathan stood abruptly, his restraint cracking. You've always done this, turned everything into a moral lesson. Maybe you enjoyed martyrdom too much. I looked up at him. And you've always confused inheritance with love. Maybe you enjoyed taking too much. He went quiet, chest rising and falling. For the first time, I saw the small boy he used to be, the one who'd clung to Edward's hand at the docks, terrified of waves. Somewhere along the way, that boy had drowned, and only ambition came ashore. He sighed, defeated. So that's it then, you're done with us. No, I said softly. I'm done waiting for you to arrive. Cynthia rose, smoothing her skirt. You'll regret this, Mrs. Ellison. Grief passes, paperwork does not. Good, I said. Then you'll remember me each tax season. She forced a brittle smile. You've changed. Not enough, I replied. They left without another word. When the car disappeared down the lane, I felt my hands trembling not from fear, but from something older, heavier, finally lifting. I hadn't realized how much their absence had already existed inside my presence. I walked to the window. The sea had calmed, the tide was retreating, leaving behind a glistening trail of shells and seaweed, small, stubborn remnants of the storm. Edward used to say, "The sea takes what it must, but it always gives something back." Maybe this was what it gave me, quiet, earned, and unspectacular. That night, I lit the fireplace for the first time since the funeral. The flames caught slowly, licking the wood like cautious forgiveness. I sat in Edward's chair, the one by the window, and let the warmth find its way into my bones. The clock ticked, the house breathed again. I whispered into the fire, I think I've finally stopped asking for their love. Outside, the wind shifted, the tide changed again. Morning light crawled over the horizon like a shy visitor. The sea outside was calm again, the air sharp and metallic with the scent of salt and iron. I woke before dawn, unable to rest. There was something about silence after confrontation it doesn't soothe. It hums. I wrapped Edward's wool shawl around my shoulders and went to the kitchen. The kettle whistled, and for a moment I could almost hear him humming, that same low tune he used to whistle when charting maps. I poured my tea, added honey the way he'd liked it, and carried it to the table by the window. The horizon was pale gold, almost apologetic. When people say closure, they forget it often arrives not as peace but as paperwork. I opened the cabinet drawer labeled Family. The labels were Edward's handwriting square, even, so meticulously printed that even time had failed to smudge it. Inside, the folders waited like old ghosts, patient and predictable. Clara, Lifestyle. Nathan, Business. Oliver, Education. I took them out one by one. Dust gathered around me like old perfume. The first folder, Clara, smelled faintly of lemon polish and regret. Receipts for wedding venues, invoices for emergency, roof repairs that never existed, transfers for braces, tuition, clothes. I traced one line from 20 years ago, £12,000 for marketing startup idea, failed, and felt something sting behind my eyes. Beneath that, birthday card she'd sent when Oliver was a baby. The handwriting grew more careless each year, the sentences shorter, until they stopped entirely. I closed the folder gently, like laying a child to rest. Nathan's was thicker. Printed emails about a doomed investment fund. Notes from Edward warning, don't mix business with family. Bank statements showing where we'd bailed him out again and again and again. Each check had felt like a rope thrown into water, except instead of saving him, I had drowned alongside him. I found a photo tucked in the back. Nathan at 12, sitting in a small sailboat, squinting against the sun, Edward steadying the rudder behind him. The edges of the picture had curled inward, as if trying to hide from the years that followed. Edward had written on the back, "He's brave when he remembers he's loved." I stared at the photo for a long time before placing it face down. The last folder, Oliver Education, was small, barely half full. Inside were handwritten notes. £200 for summer course in marine studies, £80 for books. But there was also a letter, written in a boy's uneven script. Grandma, thank you for teaching me to make scones. You said the trick is patience. I hope I learn it one day. Love, Oliver. The page had a faint grease mark butter, maybe, and a tiny corner torn off. I pressed it against my chest. It smelled like sincerity. Sometimes the smallest proof of love outweighs a lifetime of grand gestures. After tea, I gathered all the folders except one. I carried Oliver's back to the study and placed it inside the desk drawer, the only one I planned to open again. The others I stacked neatly in a cardboard box labeled Archive. The label made me smile. Archives were for historians. But I supposed, in some quiet way, I had become one curator of the ruins of my own family. I taped the box shut and wrote a single word on top: enough. That afternoon, Martha Caldwell came by. The wind had picked up, scattering dry leaves across the porch. She knocked twice, the way she always did, not tentative, just polite. I saw Nathan's car yesterday, she said, as soon as I opened the door. He didn't bring flowers, did he? Only excuses, I replied. She laughed, the sound rough but kind. About time you stopped watering dead plants. We sat in the parlor, tea between us, the kind of silence that felt companionable rather than awkward. I told them, I said finally, everything. That the estate's going to Oliver. That they're out. Martha didn't gasp. She only nodded, slow and certain. Good. Good? I asked. You've spent your whole life building bridges they kept setting fire to. Let the ashes stay cold. She reached across the table, her wrinkled hand covering mine. You're not cruel, Margaret. You're awake. I smiled faintly. People will say otherwise. They always do when a woman stops apologizing, she said. The kettle whistled again, and she rose to pour more tea. I watched the steam curl in the light and thought of Edward, how he'd said once that steam was just water that refused to stay quiet. Martha returned with 2 cups, handed me one, and said, So what now? I prune, I said simply. Not just the roses, the memories too. She grinned. A good gardener knows when to cut. After she left, I walked into the garden. The air was damp with the promise of rain. I knelt beside the rosebush Edward had planted our first year in this house. The flowers were mostly gone now, the stems brittle and brown. I trimmed away the dead heads one by one until only the strong green remained. My knees ached, my fingers shook, but my mind was still. There's an honesty in pruning, a mercy, even. You cut what no longer serves, not because you hate it, but because you finally love yourself enough to make room for new growth. When I stood, the sea wind caught my hair, and I whispered to the empty air, You'd understand, Edward. You always did. The gulls cried overhead, sharp, defiant, alive. The call came just after 3 in the afternoon, while the wind rattled the loose pane in the hallway. I had been sewing the torn hem of a curtain, the kind of slow work that keeps your hands busy and your thoughts from wandering too far. When the phone rang, the sound startled me. Few people called anymore. Grandma? It took me a moment to place the voice, but then I smiled, soft, involuntary. Oliver, I said. Yeah, he said, his tone hesitant, softer than I remembered. I heard about Granddad. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. Mum didn't tell me he was gone. I sat down slowly, the thread still hanging from the needle. He passed nearly 3 weeks ago, I said. You didn't know? I swear I didn't, he said quickly. She just said he was sick, but not that. His voice broke slightly on the last word. That was all it took to undo me. For days I had felt like the only person carrying Edward's memory, and now here was his grandson not apologizing out of duty, but grieving out of love. I wanted to come see you, he said after a moment, if that's okay. Of course it's okay, I said. Come now if you can. He arrived an hour later, taller than I remembered, his dark hair windswept, a faint trace of salt on his jacket, the kind of salt you only get from being near the sea. He looked tired but real, a young man trying to carry too much of the world too soon. When he stepped inside, he hugged me, awkward at first, then tighter, like a child remembering where safety lives. I didn't let go first. I should have been there, he murmured. For him. For you. You're here now, I said. That's enough. He looked around the room, the photos, the shelves, the compass on the mantel. It feels smaller, he said. It hasn't changed, I replied. But maybe we have. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured him lemonade, the same jug I'd once used when he was a boy helping Edward mend the garden gate. He smiled faintly at the memory. Granddad taught me to tie sailors' knots, he said. He said one day I'd need to know how to hold things that matter. He was right, I said. He looked down at his hands. Mum said you're changing things. The will, I mean. I am. She said it's not fair. I raised an eyebrow. Did she also tell you why? He hesitated, then shook his head. She said you're angry. I'm not angry, Oliver, I said. Anger burns fast. This is something slower, clearer. I'm just finished pretending. He nodded slowly, as if weighing my words. She's not going to take it well. I don't expect her to, I said. But this isn't punishment. It's protection for what's left of decency in this family. After a pause, I rose and fetched the manila folder from the desk, the one Mr. Crane had given me. I placed it gently in front of him. He frowned. What's this? My plan, I said. The cottage, the savings, everything Edward and I built. It's all to be held in trust for you. He blinked, stunned. For me? Why? Because you came, I said simply. His throat tightened. But I don't deserve that. Deserve has nothing to do with it. You showed up without being called. That's enough. He opened the folder, eyes scanning the text, and then he closed it again, setting it down with reverence. Grandma, he said softly, I don't know what to say. Then don't, I said. Just promise me one thing when you build something of your own. Make sure it's not hollow. He nodded, eyes glistening. I will. We sat for a long time after that, not speaking. The light shifted, painting gold across the floor. Somewhere outside, the tide began to rise again. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. Can I come back next weekend? He asked. Maybe we can make scones again. I smiled, full and unguarded. Bring the good butter this time. He grinned, the kind of grin that carried Edward's ghost within it. Deal. After he left, the house didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. I returned to the kitchen, poured the last of the lemonade into my glass, and stood at the window. The sun was low now, touching the horizon, turning the sea into a molten mirror. I whispered, He came, Edward, the one who remembered. The wind answered through the cracks in the pane, soft, steady, approving. I sat at the table, folded my hands, and for the first time since the funeral, I prayed. Not for forgiveness, for continuity. Because sometimes love doesn't skip generations. It simply hides, waiting for one kind heart to find it again. I woke the next morning with the kind of ache that felt lighter, almost necessary, like a limb waking after too long a sleep. The sea outside was calm, the sky thinly painted with gold. I dressed without hurry, brushing my fingers along the banister Edward had carved himself. He'd always said a house only lived if people touched it. For years I had kept everything pristine, dustless, lifeless, untouched. Now, I ran my hands over everything. I wanted to feel it breathe again. The knock came just before noon. I didn't need to open the door to know who it was, that particular rhythm of uncertainty, guilt, and entitlement wrapped into one. Mother, Nathan said when I opened the door, hat in hand like a schoolboy caught late. His voice was softer than I expected. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Oliver, looking uneasy. I asked him to come, Nathan said quickly, reading my surprise. I thought you might prefer a buffer. I smiled faintly. Ah, a human shield. Nathan tried to laugh, failed. Something like that. Come in, both of you, I said, stepping aside. The air between us was taut, but not hostile, not yet. Oliver sat quietly at the edge of the sofa, eyes darting between us like a referee who'd rather be anywhere else. Nathan looked older than he had the week before. His face, once full of that polished city confidence, now carried a fatigue that no spa or salary could disguise. There were lines at the corners of his eyes I hadn't noticed before, maybe because he'd never looked at me this directly. I heard you've been unwell, he began. I've been alive, I corrected. That's an improvement, he winced. Mum, I didn't come to argue. Then what did you come for? He took a breath. To understand. For a moment, I saw Edward in him, that same need for reason, the same fear of chaos. Nathan had inherited his father's logic, but none of his humility. "You want to understand why I changed the will?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "because from where I stand, it looks like you're trying to erase us." "I'm not erasing you," I said quietly. "I'm simply stopping the rot from spreading." He flinched. "That's harsh." "So is indifference," I replied. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "Do you really think I didn't care? I just didn't know how to show up." "You learn by trying," I said. "You both had 40 years of lessons." Oliver shifted uncomfortably. Maybe everyone just forgot what showing up means." We both looked at him. His face flushed, but he didn't back down. "Mom always said you were difficult," he said to me. "But I don't think you are. I think you're just done being disappointed." Nathan turned sharply toward him. "Oliver." "No," I said gently. "Let him speak." Oliver swallowed. "You always said family means being there. Not for money or convenience. Just being there." She forgot. He forgot. "Maybe I will someday too, but at least I'll know what it costs when you do." Nathan exhaled slowly, a tremor in his breath. "He's your favorite, isn't he?" I didn't answer immediately. "No, he's just the only one who remembers how to love without an invoice." Nathan leaned back, rubbing his temples. "So this is it. You've made up your mind." "I have," I said. He stood, frustration bleeding through his posture. "You always said forgiveness was a strength." "It is," I said. "But so is discernment. I forgive you. I just won't fund your forgetting." He stared at me, speechless. "I'll send you the legal copy," I added, not to provoke, just to close the circle. His jaw clenched. "You've become cold." I shook my head. "No, just tempered." When he left, he didn't slam the door. That, in itself, felt like progress. Oliver lingered. "He's angry," he said softly. "I know. He'll get over it." "I don't need him to," I said. "I just need him to live with it." He nodded, then looked around the room. "Granddad's compass is still here." "Of course," I said. "It never lost its direction." He smiled. "Neither did you." I laughed softly. "Oh, I did, but I learned to steer by the stars instead." After he left, I sat by the window again, watching the waves crawl against the shore. The tide was low, long fingers of sand, stretching toward the horizon. In the distance, a lone fisherman cast his line, patient, steady. Edward used to say that patience wasn't about waiting, it was about how you waited. I finally understood that now. I'd spent years waiting for affection, apology, acknowledgement. Now, I was waiting for something else: renewal. The kind of peace that doesn't ask permission to exist. That evening, I wrote a short note and slipped it into the folder marked Oliver. "You came. You saw what stayed. And that's how families are rebuilt, not by inheritance, but by presence." That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked like an old violin, every floorboard groaning under the memory of footsteps that no longer passed over them. I walked through the rooms barefoot, each one a capsule of silence. Edward's study smelled of oil and cedar. My music room still held the faint scent of polish and dust. The piano keys yellowed like old teeth. I sat down and pressed a single note. The sound trembled through the air, lingering longer than I expected. It was enough to make the walls listen again. I hadn't played since the funeral. Edward always said music was the most honest form of memory. It never lies, it only lingers. So I played. Softly at first, then louder, until grief became melody. The house seemed to wake. The curtains shifted in the draft, and the fire flickered higher. For years, I'd taught others to play children with nervous fingers, housewives chasing a lost hobby, widowers looking for rhythm in absence. And now, at 78, I realized I'd forgotten to teach the most important student: myself. The song wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The next morning, the sea mist pressed against the windows again. The tide was high, the kind of day sailors stayed in harbor. I brewed coffee, black and strong, and sat by the hearth. I thought about all the things I had once called love: late-night phone calls, asking for help, polite thank you notes, obligations dressed as gratitude. But love isn't an IOU. It's a quiet presence, unasked for, given freely. Maybe that's why Oliver's visit had meant so much. It wasn't grand. It was true. In the afternoon, I went into the attic for the first time in years. The air was dry and heavy with time. Sunlight filtered through the small round window, illuminating the dust like floating ghosts. I opened an old chest Edward had built during his first year at sea. Inside were relics of our youth postcards, shells, letters, a faded map of the Atlantic with his penciled routes, and a stack of envelopes tied with ribbon. I untied the ribbon and read the first letter. Margaret, the sea is calm tonight. The stars look like scattered music notes. I think of you every time the wind shifts because you always knew how to read what it meant before I did. Each letter carried his voice. Each line a reminder that love, once spoken honestly, never dies, it just changes dialect. I read them all until my eyes blurred. Then I found something I'd forgotten existed, a half-finished piece of sheet music. My handwriting in the margins read Concerto of Silence, unfinished. I smiled faintly. Edward used to tease me about it. You'll finish it when you find the right silence, he'd said. Maybe I'd finally found it. Later that day, Martha stopped by again, her coat wet from drizzle. You look different, she said as soon as she stepped in, like someone who's made peace with her ghosts. Maybe I just outlived them, I replied. She chuckled. Same difference. We sat by the fire, tea between us. I saw Oliver yesterday, she said. He waved. Polite boy. Reminds me of your Edward, same steadiness. Yes, I said softly. He has that quiet loyalty. It's rare now. Martha nodded, sipping her tea. So, you'll teach him the garden? Maybe, I said. Maybe I'll start with the roses. They're stubborn this year. She smirked. You always were. We laughed quietly, the sound blending with the crackle of the fire. After she left, I returned to the piano. The sheet music waited where I'd left it. I placed it on the stand, took a breath, and began to play again this time, not from memory, but from instinct. The melody was soft, hesitant, then fuller like light breaking through fog. It carried no sorrow, only truth. As I played, I whispered, "This is for you, Edward, for the storms we survived, for the silences we mistook for peace." When I stopped, the air felt lighter. The sea outside murmured against the rocks, as if answering in its own language. I sat there for a while, hands resting on the keys, thinking of what music had always been for me. Not escape, but translation. And I realized, for the first time, that solitude didn't mean absence. It meant ownership. This house, this silence, this new rhythm, they were mine now. I looked around at the dim, warm room and thought, maybe peace doesn't come after the storm. Maybe it's the sound that remains when the thunder runs out of breath. The first frost arrived early that year. It came quietly, veiling the garden in silver dust, turning the rose bushes into glass sculptures under the dawn light. I stepped outside in my wool coat, breath clouding in the cold air. The sea beyond the cliffs had turned the color of pewter. It was beautiful, in a lonely sort of way, the kind of beauty that asks nothing from you except your gaze. I bent to brush the frost off Edward's bench. The wood creaked under my weight as I sat, the way it used to when he'd joined me with 2 mugs of cocoa and that unspoken rhythm we'd kept for 50 years. A conversation built on silence, shared gazes, small nods. Another winter, love, I whispered. Another tide. The wind caught my hair, cool and familiar. Somewhere in the distance, the lighthouse blinked slow, steady, loyal. The crunch of gravel broke the stillness. I turned to see Oliver walking up the path, carrying a paper bag and a shy smile. "Morning, Grandma," he said. "You weren't answering your phone, so I figured I'd check in." "I'm too old to answer machines that beep at me," I replied, standing to hug him. "What's in the bag?" He grinned. "Breakfast. From that bakery near the harbor, the one with the terrible parking and the good pastries." We went inside, the kitchen filling with the smell of butter and cinnamon. He poured coffee while I found plates. The small, ordinary act felt miraculous, 2 generations, filling the house with warmth again. We ate by the window. The frost glinted outside like spilled salt, the sea breathing in slow waves. "I've been thinking," Oliver said between bites of croissant, "about this place." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, should I be worried?" He smiled. "No, just wondering if we could make something of it. Not sell it, not change it, but use it. Maybe as a kind of refuge, for people who need quiet. Students, maybe. Artists. People like you." I studied him. "People like me?" He nodded. "The ones who listen before they speak." A laugh escaped me, genuine, surprised. You'd make a fine philosopher, Oliver Hayes. Just a marine biologist with too many ideas, he said with a shrug. I looked out the window at the waves, slow and deliberate. It's a good idea, I said, but you'll need patience. Real things take time to grow. He smiled, that same steady light in his eyes that Edward once carried. Then I'll grow it slow. When he left later that afternoon, I walked him to the garden gate. Bring gloves next time, I said. I'll teach you to prune roses properly. I thought you said they're stubborn this year. They are, I said, but stubborn things tend to survive. He kissed my cheek and went down the path, his boots crunching over frost. I stood there long after he'd disappeared from sight. The cold bit my fingers, but I didn't mind. Some kinds of warmth don't come from fire. That evening, I built a small fire in the hearth and sat at the desk with Edward's old quill. The house was still, the sort of stillness that feels expectant rather than empty. I began a letter not to Nathan or Clara, but to Oliver. My dearest boy, if you ever wonder why I chose you, it wasn't because you were perfect. It was because you were kind when no one was watching. Remember this. Love is not measured by presence at the table, but by the effort to return when the chairs are empty. You carry your grandfather's steadiness and my stubborn heart. Use both wisely. When you feel lost, listen for the sea. It remembers all things worth keeping. I signed it simply, Grandma M. I folded it carefully and placed it inside the folder marked Oliver, beneath the trust papers and his childhood letter about the scones. Later, I stood at the window again. The moon had risen, pale and cold, casting the garden in silver. The frost glimmered, and for a moment, the world looked perfectly still, as though time itself had stopped to take a breath. Edward, I whispered, he'll be all right. You'd like him. You'd see yourself in him. A gust of wind rattled the panes in reply. I smiled. Yes, I said softly. I know, he's stubborn, too. The house sighed, wood settling in the heat of the fire. I turned off the lamp and let the quiet hold me. Sometimes peace isn't found in escape. It's found in a single, ordinary day that doesn't demand anything more of you than to notice it's beautiful. Winter deepened its grip on Cornwall. The mornings came later, blue and reluctant, the air edged with salt and cold iron. I had taken to lighting the fire before dawn, the ritual of it steadying me. There's something honest about flame it devours and illuminates in the same breath. I found myself waking earlier each day. Perhaps it was age, or perhaps the strange excitement of living for no one but myself. The absence of demands was its own kind of luxury. I would brew tea, open the curtains, and watch the sea gnaw at the shore like a patient sculptor, shaping the cliffs one wave at a time. Sometimes I spoke aloud to Edward, to the house, to myself. Silence, I discovered, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything you were too busy to hear before. It was on such a morning that the letter came. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Clara. I turned it over twice before opening it. The paper inside was creased, written hastily, the ink pressed hard into the page. Mother, I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not even sure I deserve to ask. But I want you to know that Oliver told me what you've done about the trust, about the house. And though I was furious at first, I've been thinking, maybe you're right. Maybe we became the kind of people who mistake comfort for love. I don't know how to fix that. I'm not even sure I can. But I want to try. I miss you, though I've never said it. I know I wasn't there when you needed me most. That's something I'll live with. If you'll let me visit, I'd like to come next week. Alone. Clara. I sat there for a long while, the fire crackling beside me. The anger I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt an ache so old it almost felt like nostalgia. I placed the letter on the mantel, next to Edward's compass. She's trying, I said aloud. A bit late, but she's trying. The compass needle quivered, catching the draft, as if agreeing. Clara arrived on a Thursday, wrapped in a long gray coat that looked expensive and impractical for Cornwall's wind. She carried no flowers this time, no gifts, no pretense, just a small tremor of humility in her eyes. Mother, she said softly when I opened the door. Clara, I replied. Come in before you freeze. The warmth of the house seemed to surprise her. It smells the same, she murmured, glancing around. Like pine and tea leaves. And damp wood, I added. The scent of endurance. We sat by the fireplace, the tea tray between us. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind rattled the chimney like an impatient spectator. Finally, she said, "I didn't come to argue." "Good," I said. "I'm too old for that sport." She gave a small, weary laugh. "I'm sorry, Mum. For everything. For missing the funeral. For making you feel alone." "You didn't make me feel alone, Clara," I said gently. "You just confirmed it." Her eyes brimmed, but she didn't cry. "I thought I was protecting myself from grief. I see now I was just avoiding love." "Love and grief are the same thing wearing different faces," I said. "You can't have one without inviting the other to stay." She nodded slowly. "Can I see his study?" "Of course." I watched as she walked into the room that had once been Edward's sanctum. Her hands traced the edges of his desk, the shelves, the compass. I saw her lips move, though I couldn't hear the words. When she returned, she looked different, softer, smaller. "Do you forgive me?" she asked quietly. I took her hand, felt the familiar warmth, the pulse I'd once felt when she was a child asleep in my arms. "Forgiveness isn't something I give. It's something I stopped withholding." She pressed my hand to her cheek, tears slipping through her fingers. We spent the afternoon talking not about the will, not about the years we'd lost, but about small, ordinary things. Her garden in Brighton, the sound of gulls near her flat, the way Oliver still left his dishes unwashed after breakfast. When she left that evening, she hugged me, not polite, not staged, a real hug, the kind that trembles with unfinished history. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" I asked. "For not closing the door." I smiled. I was tempted. She laughed through her tears. "I know." After she left, the house felt strangely full again, not with noise, but with the echo of possibility, the kind of quiet that hums with beginnings. I poured a final cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the frost creep back over the garden. "Edward," I whispered, "they're learning. Slowly, but they're learning." Outside, the sea breathed its endless breath, steady and patient. Sometimes, healing isn't a storm, it's a thaw. For the first time in years, I woke to laughter echoing through the house. It took me a moment to remember where I was. The sound was so unfamiliar, so alive. It was Oliver, downstairs, his voice mingling with Clara's. They were making breakfast together, the scent of toast and marmalade drifting up the stairs. I sat on the edge of my bed, smiling into the quiet warmth of it. Edward used to say that the hardest part of love was surviving the silences between tides, those long, still stretches where nothing seems to move but everything is being reshaped beneath the surface. Maybe that's what was happening now. I dressed slowly, savoring the creak of the floorboards, the familiar ache in my knees. When I came down, Oliver was setting the table, and Clara was pouring tea. "Morning, Grandma," he said. "We were going to surprise you." "You did," I said. "I thought the ghosts had started cooking." Clara laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounded like an apology in disguise. We ate together by the window. The sky was low and pale, and the sea looked like pewter again still, but not lifeless. "I can't believe how quiet it is here," Clara said. "I forgot how loud London feels until I came back." "You mistake noise for life," I said gently. "They're not the same thing." She nodded. "I think I'm beginning to see that." Oliver nudged her with his elbow. "She's even been helping me in the garden." I raised an eyebrow. "The woman who once declared mud a form of personal insult?" Clara chuckled, blushing. "I'm learning. Slowly." "Good," I said. "The roses respond better to sincerity than speed." After breakfast, Oliver went out to repair the porch railing again. He had an endless fascination with improving things that had survived perfectly fine for decades. Clara stayed behind, helping me wash dishes. The clink of porcelain against water filled the small kitchen like a hymn. "Mom," she said quietly after a while, "I didn't tell you everything in my letter." I waited. "I separated from Simon 3 months ago. I didn't want to admit it. Not to you, not to anyone. It felt like failure." I turned off the tap. "Sometimes ending something is the bravest thing you can do." She looked down, tears pooling. "I thought you'd say I told you so." "I might have," I said with a faint smile, "if I thought it would help." We both laughed softly, and the air between us, brittle for so long, finally cracked open. Later, we went out to the garden. The frost was melting, leaving the earth damp and dark. I handed her a pair of gloves. "Careful," I said. "The thorns bite." They get that from you, she teased. We worked side by side, pruning dead branches, clearing leaves, the rhythm of it soothing. She moved slowly, awkwardly at first, then more sure-footed. The roses might not bloom until spring, but the act of tending to them felt like faith. At one point she stopped and said, "I don't know how you stayed here all these years. It must have been so lonely." It was, I admitted. But I learned something about loneliness. What's that? It's only unbearable when you keep waiting for it to end. Once you make peace with it, it starts teaching you things. She looked at me for a long moment before nodding. I think I'm starting to learn that too. When the sun began to sink, the sea turned to fire. We stood together, gloves muddy, fingers numb, hearts strangely full. "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" she asked quietly. "Your father?" I smiled. "He'd be furious it took us this long." She laughed, and for the first time, her laughter didn't sound fragile. That night, after they'd both gone to bed, I sat alone in the sitting room. The fire burned low. I opened the small wooden box on the mantel and took out Edward's letters. I read one at random. "Dearest Margaret, if you ever find yourself alone, remember, the tide always returns, even when you can't see it coming. Wait for it. It will carry what's meant to find you." I set the letter down, eyes stinging. "You were right, love," I whispered. It came back, just not the way we expected. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sea salt and new beginnings through the cracks in the window frame. Some silences, I thought, aren't empty. They're just waiting to be filled. The next morning began with the faint sound of humming. It wasn't from the kettle or the radio. It was Clara, humming as she swept the kitchen floor, her voice soft and low, the kind of absent-minded tune people make when they're comfortable again. I paused at the top of the stairs, listening. It was a tune I hadn't heard in years, Edward's song, the one he used to whistle while fixing the windows or mending nets in the garden shed. The melody drifted through the house like sunlight sneaking through old curtains, cautious but bright. For a long time, I simply stood there, letting the sound wrap around me. When grief has lived in your bones long enough, joy startles you like hearing laughter in a churchyard. Clara looked up when I entered the kitchen. "I hope I didn't wake you," she said, embarrassed. "Quite the opposite," I replied, smiling. "You've resurrected your father before breakfast." She blushed. "Oliver told me about that song, said Granddad used to whistle it every morning." I nodded. "He said the sea kept tempo." She poured me tea, her hand steady now. "You know," she said, "I think I understand why you love this place. It's quiet, but not empty. Everything here feels like it's listening." "That's because it is," I said. "The walls remember everything. So does the sea." She laughed softly. "Then I should probably stop talking to it about my mistakes." "It's heard worse," I said, "and it forgives easily." Oliver joined us soon after, his hair wild, smelling faintly of salt and sawdust. "Morning, you two," he said, grabbing a biscuit. "You'll never believe it, the porch is fixed. It doesn't even squeak anymore." "Then it's lost its character," I teased. He grinned. "You're impossible." "I'm consistent," I corrected. We ate together, the three of us, the kind of ordinary meal that feels miraculous because it isn't. For once, no one rushed to fill the silences. They just existed soft, natural, alive. After breakfast, Clara went into town, leaving Oliver and me to sort through the attic. The air up there smelled of cedar and old summers. We opened boxes filled with relics, postcards, concert programs, even a stack of old piano books with my handwriting in the margins. "What's this?" Oliver asked, pulling out a folder labeled Concerto of Silence. I froze. "That," I said, "is the piece I never finished." "Why not?" "I was waiting for the right kind of silence," I said. "Back then, life was too loud." He flipped through the pages, eyes scanning the incomplete measures, the pencil notes. "You should finish it." I smiled faintly. "At my age, finishing things feels overrated." He shook his head. "No, Grandma, it's not about finishing. It's about continuing." That stopped me. For a moment, the air felt charged as though Edward himself were standing in the corner, smiling that knowing smile. That afternoon, after Oliver left to meet a friend in town, I sat at the piano with the sheet music in front of me. The ink was faded, the staff lines crooked, but the melody still breathed beneath it. My fingers hovered over the keys. Then I began. The first notes were hesitant, cracked by age and rust, but the rhythm found itself, as if it had just been waiting for my hands to come home. The melody unfolded, part elegy, part lullaby. Edward's theme wove through it like a tide pulling softly at the shore. As I played, something in me loosened. Every forgotten piece of love, every unanswered question, every lonely night, it all melted into sound. By the time the last note faded, the sun had set, and the house was dark except for the glow of the fire. I sat there a long while, breathing, trembling, alive. When Clara returned, she found me still at the piano. "Mum," she whispered, "that was beautiful." "It was his song," I said, "but it's ours now." She stood behind me, resting her hands on my shoulders. "You should write it down." "I will," I promised. "And when I'm gone, it's yours to finish." She smiled, tears glistening. "Then I'll make sure it never ends." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the strange mercy of time. It doesn't heal by erasing. It heals by layering new music over the old, until grief becomes harmony. Some nights, that harmony was all that kept me company. But tonight, I didn't feel alone. The sea outside kept rhythm. The stars hummed in quiet time. And for the first time in decades, I slept without dreaming of departure. The morning came with wind. Not the gentle kind that flutters curtains, but the fierce, restless kind that makes the sea roar like an untamed heart. The entire coastline trembled under its breath, and I could feel the house, this old, faithful house, holding its ground like it always had. When I came downstairs, Oliver was already there, hammering at something by the porch. "You're going to get yourself blown into France," I said from the doorway. He turned, laughing. "Just reinforcing the railing. This wind's got opinions." "You've inherited that from me," I said, tugging my shawl tighter. By noon, the storm had grown heavier. The waves were flinging themselves against the cliffs with the kind of determination that made me think of Edward, never reckless, just deliberate. I brewed soup while the house moaned and sighed like an old violin. Clara joined me in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, moving with a calm I hadn't seen in years. "I don't know how you live through winters here," she said, ladling broth into bowls. "I don't live through them," I replied. "I live with them." Outside, the wind screamed against the shutters, and she smiled faintly. "That sounds like something Dad would have said." "It is," I said softly. "I just say it with more wrinkles." We ate by candlelight, the electricity flickering with every gust. The storm's voice was deep and unrelenting, but inside, it felt safe. Maybe peace isn't the absence of chaos, I thought. Maybe it's the courage to light a candle anyway. "Do you ever think about moving?" Clara asked suddenly. "Every winter," I said, smiling. "And then spring comes, and I forget why I wanted to leave." "I think I get it now," she said, glancing toward the window where the sea raged in the dark. "It's wild, but it's honest." "Like love," I said. "Or motherhood," she replied softly. Our eyes met. No need for more words. Later that night, when the storm began to ease, I went to the study and opened the small iron box where I kept all the important papers, the trust, the deeds, the letters. But tonight, I added something new, the finished sheet music. Concerto of Silence. Completed. I folded it carefully, slipped it between Edward's letters, and wrote on the inside of the lid in black ink. "To those who find this, remember that everything you love leaves a sound behind. Listen for it." Then I locked the box and placed it back under the desk. When I returned to the sitting room, Clara and Oliver were asleep by the fire. He was slumped in the armchair. She was curled up on the sofa, a book still open on her lap. I stood there, heart swelling in a way I hadn't felt since before loss made me cautious. This quiet, unremarkable scene was what I had fought for. Not money, not legacy. Continuity. The kind of love that survives even when no one's looking. I stirred the fire, and a spark jumped into life. For a moment, the flames reflected in the glass cabinet a mirror of warmth in a house that had once known only silence. The wind outside softened to a sigh. The sea, calmer now, rolled against the shore like a creature settling into sleep. I closed my eyes and whispered to the darkness, "You kept your promise, Edward." The tide returned. Before I went to bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving behind that scent only the sea can make, half salt, half memory. The moon peeked through torn clouds, and the horizon glowed faintly, as if the world itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. The waves still moved restlessly, but they no longer sounded angry. They sounded alive. I realized then that the sea wasn't something to endure. It was something to belong to. It taught me patience, surrender, and resilience, the same lessons love had always tried to teach me. And for the first time, I truly understood what Edward had meant when he said, "We don't live by the sea, Maggie. We live because of it." When morning came, it carried a kind of hush that only follows a night of storms. The world outside glistened. Each branch and stone seemed polished by the sea's temper. I stepped out barefoot, the earth still wet under my feet, the air smelling of salt and resurrection. The roses, those stubborn old survivors, had endured. Their leaves were bruised but alive. Drops of water clung to them like pearls. I crouched to inspect one bloom, its edges torn but its heart intact. "You've done well," I whispered, brushing the petals. It struck me then grief is like a garden after a storm. You can't control what breaks, only what you choose to nurture afterward. Oliver joined me soon after, a mug of coffee in hand, hair still sleep mussed. "You're out early," he said. "I'm old. We wake with the light or with regret," I teased. He laughed. "Then it's the light for you. Today, yes." He looked around, surveying the damp earth and the bowed trees. "You know, Grandma, I think this place is going to change lives one day." "It already has," I said quietly. "Yours, mine, your mother's. That's enough." He shook his head. "No, I mean really change lives. I've been thinking about that refuge idea, maybe turning part of the property into an artist's retreat. I could handle the logistics, grants, the environmental permits." I raised an eyebrow. "You make it sound so simple." He smiled. "It's not, but it feels right." Later, over breakfast, we told Clara about it. She was quiet for a long time before speaking. "You know," she said, "your father always dreamed of this place being more than a home. He used to say the sea was too generous to keep to ourselves." Oliver looked at her in surprise. "He said that?" She nodded. "When I was a teenager, we'd sit outside on stormy nights. He'd say the waves were trying to teach us generosity, that giving was a form of survival." I smiled. He was right. And he'd be proud of both of you for remembering. The day passed in gentle labor, cleaning, mending, tending. I hung fresh linens near the window, the breeze carrying the scent of the sea through the house. Clara baked scones, her first attempt since she was 15. Oliver worked on repairing the fence by the cliff. It was an ordinary day, but it shimmered with something larger continuity, I suppose, the quiet miracle of 3 generations choosing to stay. In the evening, we gathered by the fire. Oliver played one of Edward's old records, the kind with soft jazz and the faint hiss of age. Clara dozed off with her head on my shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the child she once was, freckled, messy-haired, forever asking why. I looked around the room. The same walls that had witnessed loss now cradled laughter. The same air that had once carried goodbyes now hummed with beginnings. Edward would have loved this. He would have said, "See, Maggie, even broken shells hold the sound of the sea." That night, after they'd gone to bed, I stayed awake at the window. The moonlight spilled across the garden, silvering the wet soil. I could hear the faint rhythm of the waves, steady and infinite. I thought about time, how it doesn't take from us. It trades. Every sorrow, every ache, is exchanged for something softer if we let it be. On the writing desk sat a blank sheet of paper. I picked up my pen and began to write. "To whoever finds this house one day, know that peace is not inherited. It's cultivated, like a stubborn garden. You'll fail, you'll prune, you'll start again. But if you listen, truly listen, the sea will teach you how to forgive the wind and how to bloom anyway." I folded the letter and placed it under the lamp. Not for lawyers, not for archives, just for whoever needed it next. Outside, the roses stirred in the night breeze. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the whisper of waves, the same music that had carried me through years of absence. For the first time, I didn't think of loss as something I had survived. I thought of it as something that had shaped the space where love could return. And in that quiet, eternal rhythm between sea and heart, I found something I'd never expected to find again: hope. Spring came softly that year, like an apology the earth had been meaning to make. The days grew longer, and sunlight crept through the lace curtains again. The sea, calmer now, glimmered beneath a pale sky, its voice quieter not because it had grown weak, but because it no longer needed to shout. I spent my mornings walking along the cliff path with my cane, the one Edward carved for me from driftwood decades ago. Every turn in the trail felt familiar, yet lighter, as if the weight that had lived in my bones for years had finally learned how to let go. When I returned, the house was alive. Clara humming in the kitchen, Oliver sanding the old banister, gulls crying overhead. I didn't say it aloud, but the silence that once haunted this home had turned into music again, our kind of music. That afternoon, while Oliver fixed the garden gate, I went into Edward's study one last time. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. I opened the window, letting in the ocean's breath, and sat down at his desk. In the drawer was the old letter I had started writing to myself months ago, the one I'd meant to finish when everything felt right. The page was yellowed, the ink faded, but I knew what it needed to say, so I began again. To the woman who stayed when everyone else left, you once thought love meant giving without measure. You were wrong. It means knowing when to stop before you disappear. You carried more than anyone should have to, but you did it with grace, and for that, the world owes you its quiet respect. You are not invisible. You were the keeper of warmth, the witness of lives that forgot to thank you, the voice that hummed beneath storms. And when the world forgot your name, the sea remembered it. You have done enough. You have loved enough. You have lived enough. Now, rest. I placed the letter inside the iron box, beneath the finished composition and Edward's compass, and locked it gently. Then I whispered, "It's yours now, love. Our story's complete." That evening, the three of us sat outside with tea as the sun sank over the cliffs. The horizon burned gold, and the waves rolled in slow, even rhythm, the same rhythm Edward used to breathe when he slept beside me. Oliver spoke first. "You know, Grandma, when we start the retreat, I want to call it something that means something. Something yours." I smiled. "Call it the Grant House. Not for me. For the act itself, for granting space, granting peace." He nodded, the wind catching his hair. "That's perfect." Clara reached over and squeezed my hand. "You know, Mom, you were right. Peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It just walks in quietly and sits beside you." "Exactly," I said. "And if you're not paying attention, you might mistake it for silence." We watched the sun melt into the horizon until only a silver line remained. That night, after they had gone inside, I stayed out on the porch. The sky stretched endlessly indigo, vast, eternal. Somewhere, far below, the waves kept their rhythm. I closed my eyes and listened. There was no loneliness in the sound anymore, only continuity, only love, reshaped by time. Later, before bed, I found a note slipped under my door. Oliver's handwriting. "Grandma, when you're not here someday, I'll keep the music playing. I'll finish the garden. I'll keep the light in the window for anyone who's lost. I promise." Oh, I read it twice, then placed it beside Edward's compass, the perfect symmetry of past and future. Before I blew out the candle, I whispered to the sea, "You can rest now." But it didn't rest. It rolled on, tireless, as if reminding me that nothing truly ends, it only changes shape. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't the closing of a story. It was the continuation of one, a legacy passed, not through money, but through the act of showing up, again and again, even after the storms. The house sighed in the wind, warm and alive. The roses stirred outside, ready to bloom. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a witness to love. I felt like its proof. So, if you've read this far, if my story has found you, remember this. Peace isn't given, it's chosen. And love doesn't die when the world forgets your name. It waits like the sea for you to listen again. If this story found something true in you, share it, tell someone, or hold it close, quietly. That too is enough.